The first written word was not carved in stone to honor a king, nor etched into metal to praise the gods. It was pressed into soft clay to count sacks of grain. That small, ordinary act, marking food for the community, was the spark that turned memory into history. Tonight we step back more than 5,000 years to the quiet marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where human hands first shaped the stories that would outlast their own lives. Picture a flat horizon stretching endlessly under the pale glow of the moon. The land is hushed, save for the low rustle of reeds swaying in the night air. Two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, wind like ribbons of silver through the brown earth. They are the lifeblood of this place, bringing both nourishment and danger. Their floods can cover the land in fertile silt, but they can also sweep away whole villages in a single season. This tension between abundance and threat is the rhythm to which the people here live. The Greeks, many centuries later, would call this region Mesopotamia, literally between two rivers. But for the people who first settled here, it was simply home. They built huts of reeds tied with rope and small boats that skimmed the marshes like floating baskets. In these waters swam fish and waterfowl, while the land around them provided wild barley and dates. Reeds became everything: walls of houses, mats for sleeping, baskets for carrying, and eventually the tool to press symbols into clay. From this quiet and seemingly unremarkable environment came one of the greatest transformations in human history: the birth of cities, law, astronomy, literature, and organized memory. At first, these people lived in tiny farming hamlets. Families worked together to grow barley, herd sheep, and store food. But the rivers demanded more than family labor. Floodwaters needed to be managed with dikes stretching for hundreds of meters, and canals had to be dug across many kilometers of fields. This was more than any household could handle. Cooperation became survival. When groups of families began to join forces, something new took shape: the earliest outlines of a city. From the necessity of organizing water and land came the earliest forms of leadership. Who decided when the canals were opened? Who ruled when two families claimed the same plot? Who organized repairs when the flood breached the dike? Slowly, figures of authority rose, sometimes priests, other times warriors. They began to gather people, give orders, and resolve disputes. The first seeds of organized power were sown not in palaces but in muddy fields where barley stalks grew. As centuries passed, villages linked together, forming larger and larger settlements. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence at Uruk, one of the oldest and most important cities, showing that its population may have reached nearly 50,000 people by the 4th millennium before Christ. That number might not sound large today, but at the time it was astonishing. No other community in the world had ever concentrated so many people in one place. Uruk was not just a large village, it was something new, a city-state, a human creation where kinship ties gave way to civic identity. To live in Uruk meant not just belonging to a family, but to a wider community with laws, markets, and shared destiny. What gave Sumer its edge was its location. To the north lay Anatolia, rich with metals. To the east rose the Zagros Mountains, with tribes that brought timber and stone. To the south stretched the Persian Gulf, a gateway to far-off lands. Goods, ideas, and skills flowed in and out, turning Sumer not into an isolated community, but a hub of exchange. This geography allowed them to transform from subsistence farmers into skilled merchants and craftspeople. In small hamlets, every family had to make its own tools, bake its own pots, and weave its own cloth. But in these new cities, people specialized. Some became full-time potters, others metal workers, others weavers, scribes, and priests. Division of labor became a powerful engine of growth. Specialization fueled innovation, and innovation gave rise to prosperity. Yet growth also brought friction. Who owned the land? Who controlled the canals? Who had the right to distribute the grain in times of scarcity? Wealthier families, often connected to temples or chiefs, accumulated more, while others struggled to keep up. Inequality emerged, shaping the first social classes: rulers, priests, artisans, farmers, and slaves. The city-state became more than a collection of houses. It became a machine with distinct parts, each with its own role. Walled fortifications protected against enemies. Central temples collected tribute and symbolized divine order. Storage facilities held grain for emergencies. Administrative offices recorded transactions with clay seals. This was a new kind of society, more complex than anything before. Managing such a society required more than memory or spoken agreements. The human voice could not hold everything. Words faded, disputes arose. People needed a way to fix agreements, to count, to remember. Out of this pressure came one of the most transformative inventions in history: writing. At first, it was simple drawings pressed into clay. A cow's head meant a cow, a jar marked wine. But soon symbols multiplied, numbers, names, and concepts appeared. And then, with a simple reed stylus cut at an angle, wedge-shaped marks replaced drawings. From this came cuneiform, the first full script. The power of writing was immense. Farmers recorded how much barley they delivered. Temples tracked livestock and offerings. Kings had their victories inscribed for posterity. Priests preserved hymns and myths. Merchants made contracts that could travel across regions. Writing was no longer just an administrative tool. It became the backbone of collective memory. For the first time in history, human beings did not have to rely only on voice or memory. Words were fixed, preserved, and passed on. Writing also reshaped power. Only a few could learn it. Scribes trained from childhood, repeating hundreds of symbols on clay tablets. These scribes became indispensable. Without them, no city could function. They were the quiet architects of civilization, ensuring that food supplies were recorded, taxes collected, rituals performed, and laws proclaimed. To be a scribe was to hold the keys to society's memory. But writing and cities were not enough. Communities also needed shared purpose, a way to believe that their hard labor and fragile existence mattered. The answer lay in the gods. To the Sumerians, the universe was alive with divine presence. Each city had its patron deity: Uruk with Inanna, Nippur with Enlil, Eridu with Enki. Temples stood at the center of each city, serving as both storehouses and spiritual cores. Religion was not separate from politics or economy. It was interwoven into every grain counted, every canal dug, every war fought. This is the world we step into tonight, a land of marshes and rivers, of reeds turned into styluses, of barley turned into bread and beer, of myths turned into written memory. The Sumerians were not the loudest civilization in history. For millennia, their very name was forgotten. Yet they gave us tools we still use every day: writing, law, cities, time measured in 60 minutes. Their story begins here, in the moonlit plains of southern Iraq, where the rivers whispered both life and destruction, and where people first learned how to turn survival into civilization. Before Sumer, Ubaid roots, circa 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. Imagine walking across a flat landscape where the land meets the sky without interruption, only broken by clusters of reed huts standing on raised patches of earth. There are no city walls yet, no grand temples towering above the fields. And yet hidden in these quiet communities, the foundation of the world's first civilization is quietly forming. This is the age of the Ubaid culture, a time older than Sumer, when scattered villages began to stitch themselves into something greater. The Ubaid story begins with water. People learned to harness the unpredictable rivers by cutting small canals that could divert floods into their fields. At first, these were simple ditches dug with stone tools and baskets. But even these modest efforts changed everything. When barley thrived in the watered soil, surpluses appeared. Surpluses meant security, and security allowed families to settle more permanently, investing in homes, pottery, and shrines. The villages of the Ubaid were not temporary camps, they were the first steps toward permanence. At Eridu, often called the world's first sacred city, archaeologists uncovered evidence of temples that were rebuilt again and again on the same spot. Each new structure was slightly larger, layered on top of the old, until what began as a small platform grew into a monumental space. This continuous rebuilding wasn't just architecture, it was memory. Each generation honored the work of those before, stacking their devotion higher. Eridu reveals a truth. Even before writing, people found ways to preserve continuity through place. Life in Ubaid villages was organized around households. The typical house was long and rectangular, divided into smaller rooms, often with a central hall. These homes weren't just shelters, they were blueprints for social life. Archaeologists noticed that house layouts across different sites were strikingly similar, suggesting a shared cultural system. In these houses, families cooked barley bread, brewed early forms of beer, and stored food in clay jars sealed with mud. Children played with clay figurines and small boats carved from reed, miniature versions of the world around them. But it was pottery that truly marks the Ubaid era. Their buffware vessels, smooth pale clay decorated with dark geometric designs, speak of both beauty and practicality. Some were for daily use, but others carried abstract patterns that seem almost symbolic, as if the act of decorating was as important as the vessel's function. The spread of these pots across Mesopotamia and beyond hints at long-distance connections. Villages were not isolated. They were exchanging goods, styles, and perhaps ideas across hundreds of kilometers. The Ubaid economy was not limited to farming. Along the marshes, people fished and hunted birds. In the drier plains, they herded sheep and goats. Herding was especially important because it produced wool, which would later power the textile industry of Sumer. Trade networks carried obsidian from Anatolia and shells from the Gulf. These early exchanges taught communities how to manage resources that came from far away, laying the groundwork for the vast trade systems of later Mesopotamian cities. Temples and granaries became central features of village life. Grain wasn't only stored privately, it was often pooled and managed communally. This created a need for some form of oversight. Who decided how much grain to store, how to distribute it, or when to prepare reserves for floods? This is where the seeds of bureaucracy first sprouted. Authority shifted slowly from family elders to temple leaders, and with it came the first experiments in collective administration. Religion in the Ubaid world was inseparable from daily survival. Clay figurines of women with elongated heads and large eyes have been found across sites. Their purpose is debated. Some say they were fertility charms, others think they represented household protectors or community spirits. What matters is that these figurines show a symbolic imagination already at work, an attempt to connect the human struggle for survival with forces beyond human control. In Eridu, the temple was dedicated to Enki, the god of water and wisdom, a fitting choice for people whose lives depended on canals and marshes. One of the lesser-known but striking features of Ubaid life was their connection to the sea. Villages at the edge of the Persian Gulf show evidence of seafaring. Reed boats coated in bitumen may have carried goods across the waves. This means that as early as the 5th millennium BCE, the ancestors of the Sumerians were already reaching beyond their rivers, experimenting with maritime trade that would later connect Mesopotamia to Bahrain, Oman, and the Indus Valley. Social organization also shifted during this period. Archaeologists noticed differences in burials. Some graves were simple, while others contained ornaments and special pottery. This suggests that social hierarchies were emerging. While not yet kings and nobles, certain families began to stand apart, possibly because of their control over grain storage, trade, or temple duties. These early inequalities set the stage for the stratified society of later Sumer. What is fascinating about the Ubaid period is how quiet its transformation was. Unlike later civilizations that rose with conquest and monuments, the Ubaid built slowly, village by village, canal by canal. Their achievements were not loud declarations of power, but steady steps in organizing community life. They didn't yet write on clay, but they laid the patterns that writing would later capture. Measured fields, shared labor, ritual devotion, and trade beyond the horizon. If we imagine standing in a Ubaid village at dusk, the picture is humble but alive. Smoke curls from reed-roofed homes where barley porridge simmers. Men and women return from the fields with baskets of grain. Children chase each other through narrow lanes. At the temple platform, elders gather, discussing the coming floods and planning repairs to the canals. Potters turn wheels, painting designs that will carry their signature across distant lands. Out on the river, reed boats glide silently, their cargo of fish, reeds, and perhaps obsidian, destined for other villages. It is not yet Sumer. But the patterns of Sumer, the reliance on water, the centrality of temples, the beginnings of inequality, and the sense of shared order are all here, waiting to unfold. The Ubaid period reminds us that civilization rarely arrives in a sudden flash. It creeps forward in gradual steps through ordinary acts repeated over generations: planting barley, weaving reed mats, repairing a canal, painting a pot. Each act seems small, yet together they form the foundation of something vast. Without the quiet centuries of the Ubaid, the brilliance of Sumer would never have been possible. Tokens, bulle, and the birth of script, how writing begins. A farmer once stood in a crowded courtyard, clutching a small clay ball in his hands. Inside it were tiny tokens, cones, spheres, and discs that represented jars of oil and sacks of barley he had delivered to the temple storehouse. The priest who accepted it smiled and pressed his seal onto the ball, locking the agreement inside. Neither man knew it then, but this simple exchange was part of a quiet revolution, the invention of writing. Before cities, memory was oral, agreements were spoken, debts remembered, and harvests counted on fingers. But as villages grew into places like Uruk, memory alone was no longer enough. Grain had to be counted in the thousands, livestock tracked across herds, and workers assigned by the hundreds. Forgetting was costly, miscounting could mean famine. The solution was to externalize memory, to place it outside the fragile human mind onto something that could last. Clay, abundant and malleable, became the first canvas for human thought. It began with tokens for each kind of item: sheep, jars of oil, measures of grain. People shaped a small clay marker. A cone might stand for a jar, a disc for a sheep, a sphere for a measure of grain. At first, these tokens were kept loose like counters in a pouch, but as transactions grew larger, they were placed inside hollow clay balls known as bulle. To secure the deal, the ball was sealed with an impression from a cylinder seal, unique and binding. The bulle could be broken later to verify what was inside. It was a clever system, but also cumbersome. Why carry a sealed ball when you could just press the tokens onto the outside? Soon, people began marking the surface of the clay with impressions of the tokens themselves. That single step, placing the sign on the surface, was the turning point, the birth of proto-writing. From there, abstraction snowballed. A drawing of a sheep meant sheep, but a drawing of a sheep's head could mean flock. A jar with lines might stand for a liquid ration. These were not sentences yet, but they were more than numbers. They were the first signs of language taking material form. By 3300 BCE, proto-cuneiform tablets were everywhere in Uruk. Hundreds survive, filled with pictographs scratched with reed styluses. They listed workers, rations, land allotments, and offerings. They captured the hum of city life in a way no memory ever could. Schools of scribes called eduba, literally tablet houses, began training children in this new skill. Imagine a dim courtyard where young apprentices sat cross-legged, clay tablets on their laps, copying signs over and over. Their styluses clicked softly in rhythm, the sound of learning. The teacher's tablet bore the model, the students' tablets bore wobbly imitations. Archaeologists have found these school exercises, and in some cases the small frustrations of students scratched into clay, insults, doodles, even little "I was here" marks. The human voice of children comes across 5,000 years later, immortalized by accident. One of the overlooked marvels of this system is its mathematics. Sumerians didn't use one counting system but several. Grain was measured differently than animals, and animals differently than land. Their number system was base 60 for some things, base 10 for others. It was practical but also ingenious. From these mixed systems emerged the sexagesimal model we still use today. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Every time we glance at a clock or compass, we echo the calculations of Sumerian scribes. The power of these signs went beyond economics. Once people realized that clay could record, they began pushing it further. Religious hymns, incantations, and lists of gods began to appear. Myths that once lived only in the voice of a storyteller could now be captured for generations unborn. Writing shifted from a tool of transaction to a medium of imagination. Inanna, Enki, Enlil, all the gods found their names pressed into clay. Over time, myths and stories expanded, leading centuries later to the great literary works like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yet, it is important to see how humble the beginnings were. Writing was not invented for poetry or philosophy. It was invented for beer, barley, and livestock. The grandeur came later. At its core, writing was about managing community life, who owed what, who worked when, who delivered how much. The mundane became the seed of the monumental. Civilization needed order, and writing was the tool that gave order permanence. What's fascinating is how quickly writing became a status symbol. Not everyone could read or write. Literacy required years of training, and only a small percentage of the population had access. Scribes became powerful, not because they ruled with swords, but because they ruled with memory. Kings needed them, temples needed them, merchants needed them. Without scribes, society's agreements dissolved into dust. With them, the world could be recorded, preserved, and retrieved. One can imagine the awe of seeing a scribe at work for the first time. A man sits with a wet clay tablet on his knee. He presses a reed into it with quick, practiced strokes. In moments, words appear, permanent, impartial, immune to forgetting. What was once fleeting is now fixed. This act must have felt like magic, and in a way it was. The transformation of thought into symbol, symbol into record, and record into memory was the closest thing to alchemy humanity had yet discovered. Writing did not replace speech, it extended it. It allowed the Sumerians to create chains of knowledge that stretched across generations. A farmer could pass down not just oral wisdom, but recorded contracts. A temple could keep track of offerings across decades. A student could learn from a teacher long dead whose clay exercises survived. Writing stitched the past to the present and the present to the future. When archaeologists first uncovered these tablets in the 19th century, they seemed unremarkable, just chunks of clay. But once deciphered, they revealed a living city. Ration lists for workers building canals, records of sheep given to temples, tallies of jars of beer distributed at festivals. Reading them is like stepping into the heartbeat of Uruk, hearing the rustle of barley sacks, the low bleating of sheep, the chatter of scribes counting late into the night. From tokens to bullae, from bullae to tablets, and from tablets to literature, the journey of writing is one of the most profound arcs in human history. It reminds us that civilization is built not only on grand monuments or famous kings, but on the quiet, practical acts of ordinary people who needed to remember. Writing began in clay courtyards filled with grain and sheep, but it grew into the voice of humanity itself. And so, with stylus and clay, the Sumerians gave us something extraordinary, a way to speak across time. Every word we read today, every story we tell, carries the echo of those first wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet earth under the Mesopotamian sun. Jemdet Nasr to early dynastic. Cities find their voices circa 3100 to 2350 BCE. A slab of stone stands tall in a museum today, its surface carved with vultures flying above heaps of fallen soldiers. This is the stele of the vultures, a relic from the rivalry of Lagash and Umma. It is one of the earliest battle records in human history, and it tells us something crucial. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Sumer's cities had found their voices. They no longer whispered through clay contracts alone. They shouted their ambitions across fields, canals, and carved monuments. The Jemdet Nasr period, around 3100 to 2900 BCE, was a bridge between the proto-writing of Uruk and the fully literate world of Sumer. Archaeologists at Jemdet Nasr, a small site northeast of Babylon, found clay tablets covered in colorful pictographs, along with painted pottery and administrative records. These show a society already comfortable with managing surpluses, organizing labor, and exporting its goods. But something else was happening. The city-states were beginning to assert distinct identities. Uruk was no longer alone. Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and Eridu had all emerged as players in a crowded political landscape. In this new environment, leadership became formalized. Earlier titles like priest and village head evolved into ensi, governors tied to temples, and lugal, literally big man, meaning king. These roles reflected a shift from community-based leadership to rulers who claimed divine sanction. Kingship was not just political, it was cosmic. The gods, it was believed, had handed kingship down from heaven to the city chosen to hold it. If Kish held power, it was because the gods willed Kish to be supreme. If Uruk held it, the heavens had shifted their favor. This belief system justified both authority and competition. The competition was fierce. Cities fought not only for glory, but for water, the lifeline of Sumer. Canals defined prosperity, and canal boundaries sparked endless disputes. The stele of the vultures erected by Eannatum of Lagash records his victory over Umma in just such a conflict. The imagery is striking. Soldiers in phalanx-like formations, helmets on their heads, spears in hand, trampling enemies beneath their feet. Above, vultures carry away severed heads, a chilling symbol of triumph. But beyond the violence, the stele also records something more practical: irrigation rights. It is as much a water treaty as it is a war memorial, showing how closely survival and sovereignty were intertwined. While kings clashed, cities flourished. Monumental architecture spread beyond Uruk. Temples grew taller, courtyards wider, storage rooms more complex. Ziggurats began to rise, though in simpler forms than the great stepped pyramids that would appear later. Each city's temple was dedicated to its patron deity: Enlil in Nippur, Enki in Eridu, Nana in Ur, Inanna in Uruk. Religion was civic identity. To belong to a city was to share in its divine protector, festivals and rituals. The gods were not abstract, they were political allies and military commanders. When armies marched, it was said that their god marched with them. Law and justice also began to take shape. One of the earliest known reformers was Urukagina of Lagash, who ruled around 2350 BCE. He is remembered for decrees that tried to protect ordinary people from exploitation by elites. His reforms limited the power of temple officials, reduced the burdens of taxation, and safeguarded widows and orphans. Though fragmentary, these records are some of the earliest examples of rulers attempting to codify fairness. It shows that even in the world's first cities, inequality and corruption were pressing concerns. Art and culture reflected this complexity. Cylinder seals now depicted scenes of myth and ritual, not just administration. Banquets, processions, and divine encounters rolled across clay in miniature dramas. Statuettes of worshippers with clasped hands and wide eyes appeared in temples, their posture frozen in perpetual devotion. These figures remind us that ordinary people sought connection with the divine just as rulers did, bringing offerings and prayers to the gods who governed their fates. One of the most fascinating features of this period is Nippur's unique role. Unlike other cities, Nippur rarely sought military supremacy. Instead, it functioned as a spiritual capital, home to Enlil, the chief of the gods. Kings from across Sumer came to Nippur to receive legitimacy. Even when cities battled each other, they acknowledged Nippur as neutral ground, a place where divine authority was concentrated. This balance gave Sumer a shared sense of unity, even amid rivalry. Everyday life in these early dynastic cities carried both routine and complexity. Farmers still rose with the sun to tend barley fields and herds. Women brewed beer, ground grain, and wove textiles. Children learned to shape clay and help in workshops. But now, alongside these traditions, new layers of social order had emerged. Slaves worked in households and temples. Merchants traveled with caravans of donkeys carrying goods across deserts. Soldiers trained for defense and conquest. Priests managed the calendar, tracking stars to predict floods and festivals. The city was a symphony of roles, each interdependent, each essential. The voice of Sumer also began to stretch beyond its borders. Trade reached Elam to the east and the Persian Gulf to the south. Archaeologists have found Indus Valley beads in Sumerian sites and Mesopotamian seals as far as Oman. These connections carried not only goods, but ideas. Cultural exchange shaped how the Sumerians thought about the world, reinforcing the sense that their cities were not isolated islands, but nodes in a wider network of human activity. By the time this period matured, Sumer had become a mosaic of independent but interconnected states. Each city-state had its ruler, its god, its army, and its ambitions. Each carved its place into history through monuments, laws, and myths, and together they created a chorus, the first true chorus of urban civilization. The voice of humanity, once scattered across isolated hamlets, had become loud, organized, and enduring. It is tempting to see these rivalries as petty squabbles over water and land, but they were also the first experiments in diplomacy, law, and collective identity. They show us that even in the earliest days of civilization, people struggled with the same questions we face today: how to share resources, how to balance power, how to live together in crowded communities without tearing each other apart. The Jemdet Nasr and early dynastic periods were a time of discovery, conflict, and creativity. Sumer was not yet an empire, but it was a world of voices rising, kings proclaiming victories, scribes scratching treaties, priests chanting hymns, and ordinary people whispering prayers to the gods of their city. It was a world finding itself, one city at a time. Households, women, and work, the social engine. The story of a civilization is never just told by its kings, temples, or battles. It is told in kitchens where bread is baked, in fields where farmers sweat under the sun, and in quiet homes where children learn the ways of their families. If monuments and laws were Sumer's skeleton, then its households were the beating heart, the living engine that made everything else possible. In the cities of Sumer, daily life revolved around barley. This simple grain was the foundation of survival and prosperity. Barley was food, drink, and even currency. It was baked into flat loaves, boiled into porridge, and brewed into beer. Beer especially mattered. In a land where river water could be polluted or dangerous, beer was safer, nourishing, and deeply social. Sumerians even had multiple words for it: thick beer, clear beer, strong beer, each with its own ritual or occasion. Imagine crowded taverns in Ur or Lagash, workers sharing clay cups of beer after long days, laughter echoing through mud brick streets. In that sense, barley wasn't just an economic staple, it was the glue of community life. Work was everywhere. Farmers tilled fields with ox-drawn ploughs, their tools tipped with bronze blades. Irrigation canals carried precious water across the parched soil, while laborers repaired dikes and channels under the supervision of temple officials. Textile production was another powerhouse of the Sumerian economy. Vast workshops, often tied to temples, employed women to spin wool and weave cloth. These textiles became a major export, traded for metals and timber that Sumer lacked. A humble weaver, working day after day at her loom, might never travel beyond the city gates, yet her labor connected her to faraway lands like Anatolia and the Indus Valley. Within households, roles were clearly marked but not entirely rigid. Women carried immense responsibilities. They ground grain, brewed beer, wove textiles, raised children, and managed household affairs. But women could also own property, conduct business, and serve as priestesses. Some even wielded extraordinary influence. The most famous of these was Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who became high priestess of the moon, god Nanna, at Ur. She wasn't just a figurehead. She composed hymns to Inanna that standardized religious liturgy across the land. Today, she is remembered as the first named author in history, an extraordinary achievement that places a woman at the very beginning of recorded literature. Marriage bound households together, but it was less about romance and more about alliances. Contracts were drawn up on clay tablets, specifying dowries, bride prices, and inheritance rights. These weren't just personal matters, they were the legal and economic backbone of society. A marriage might link two merchant families or tie a farmer's household to the temple economy. Still, love and affection were not absent. Poems survive that praise beauty, celebrate intimacy, and compare beloveds to fertile fields and blooming gardens. The sacred marriage ritual between king and goddess, performed by a high priestess, reflected the cosmic significance of union, an act that symbolized the fertility of the land itself. Children grew up in this rhythm of labor and devotion. Boys often followed their father's trades, while girls learned the skills of their mothers. But for a select few, education opened other doors. In the Adaba, or tablet school, young scribes learned to press wedge-shaped signs into clay. These students copied word lists, practiced contracts, and sometimes scribbled jokes or insults in the margins. It was tedious work, but mastering writing was a path to prestige and power. A successful scribe could serve temples, palaces, or merchants, recording the lifeblood of the city, grain counts, labor rosters, legal decrees. For their families, having a son in scribal school was like sending him into the future, where knowledge became a ladder out of ordinary life. Play and leisure also filled the household sphere. Archaeologists have uncovered game boards, the most famous being the royal game of With dice-like knucklebones and patterned squares, players raced tokens across the board in what may have been part strategy, part chance. Instructions for the game, written centuries later in cuneiform, survive, meaning we know not only how the Sumerians lived, but also how they entertained themselves. Music, too, was a constant companion. Harps, lyres, and drums turned feasts and festivals into joyful events. In the great cities, professional musicians performed at temples, but in small homes, simple reed flutes or hand drums brought rhythm to daily life. The household was also a legal unit. Contracts recorded adoption, loans, and even debt repayment in startling detail. Families sometimes adopted adults, not just children, usually to ensure heirs for property or to guarantee care in old age. Debt was another constant presence. In years of bad harvest, farmers might borrow barley from temples or nobles. If they could not repay, they risked losing land, or worse, falling into debt slavery. This harsh system created cycles of inequality, but it also spurred rulers like Urukagina to attempt reforms. Such laws remind us that behind the grandeur of kingship lay the struggles of ordinary families trying to survive. Women's lives, while essential, were also precarious. Marriage contracts revealed protections but also strict controls. Adultery by women could mean severe punishment, while men were often free to take concubines or slaves. Childbirth was dangerous, with prayers and rituals invoking goddesses like Ninhursag for protection. Still, the fact that women appear as property owners, priestesses, and even scribes shows that their presence in public life was not erased. Their contributions shaped households, temples, and trade alike. At the very bottom of society were slaves. Some were war captives, others debtors. They worked in households, temples, and fields, often side by side with free laborers. Their lives were hard, but records show they too could marry, have families, and sometimes earn or be granted freedom. The boundaries of Sumerian society were rigid, but not completely closed. When we look closely, we see that Sumer's greatness did not rest solely on kings or temples. It rested on the quiet resilience of households, on women weaving by oil lamps, on farmers steering oxen through dusty fields, on children tracing signs into clay, on merchants haggling in noisy markets. These were the gears that turned the machinery of civilization. Without them, there would be no ziggurats, no laws, no myths, just scattered voices in the desert. And so the story of Sumer is not only about invention or conquest. It is about ordinary families who carried extraordinary burdens, who balanced survival with ritual, who found joy in beer, music, and games, and who passed down the knowledge that would outlast their names. Their lives were fragile, but together they built the world's first society, a reminder that history is always written not just by rulers, but by countless hands at home. Temples, ziggurats, and the sky, religion and science entwined. Imagine walking across the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia 4,500 years ago. The horizon stretches endlessly, brown earth underfoot, blue sky above. Then, rising suddenly from the mud brick streets of the city, a stepped mountain pierces the sky. It is not a natural hill, but a ziggurat, a man-made sacred mountain of mud and baked clay, tier upon tier, each smaller than the one below, climbing toward the heavens. At its summit, a shrine gleams, believed to be the dwelling place of the city's god. To the Sumerians, this was no mere building. It was the axis between earth and sky, the ladder by which the divine could descend and bless the people. Religion in Sumer was inseparable from daily life. Every city had its patron deity, and each god or goddess was thought to rule not just the city, but also a force of nature. Enlil, god of wind and storms, governed fate. Enki, god of water and wisdom, shaped rivers and intellect alike. Nanna, the moon god, watched over time, tides, and sheep flocks. Inanna, fierce goddess of love and war, embodied passion, fertility, and destruction. These gods were not distant, they were neighbors, patrons, and at times terrifying overseers. Every flood, every harvest, every battle was their verdict. The ziggurat embodied this relationship. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, which were tombs, ziggurats were living monuments, storehouses, ritual centers, observatories. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nanna, towered above its city in massive rectangular layers, each coated in gleaming bitumen and painted bricks. Stairs rose dramatically along its sides, so priests and pilgrims could ascend in processions, carrying offerings to the god at the top. From the streets below, the ziggurat was a daily reminder that the divine dwelled among them. But temples were not only spiritual hubs, they were economic engines. Grain collected as taxes was stored in temple granaries. Wool and cloth from workshops were distributed under priestly supervision. Rations of beer and bread for laborers were measured out within their walls. The temple was at once the house of the god, the city's bank, and the manager of its workforce. In effect, religion, economy, and government were one. To offend the temple was to risk social chaos and divine wrath. Priests were not simply spiritual leaders, they were scientists, administrators, and mathematicians rolled into one. At night, they studied the stars from temple rooftops, noting the cycles of the moon, the rising of Venus, the constellations that marked planting seasons. Their observations were practical, predicting floods, fixing calendars, but also mystical. Each star belonged to a god. Venus was Inanna's star, bright and unpredictable, a perfect symbol of her dual nature as goddess of love and war. The sun belonged to Utu, the god of justice, whose rising each morning reaffirmed cosmic order. For the Sumerians, astronomy was never separate from divinity. It was divine communication written across the sky. From these observations came innovations still with us today. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal, base 60, system to measure time and space. They divided hours into 60 minutes, minutes into 60 seconds, and circles into 360 degrees. This wasn't abstract math, it was practical science born of temple needs. Priests needed to calculate irrigation schedules, align festivals with lunar cycles, and track omens in the heavens. In solving these problems, they quietly gave humanity the clock and the compass. Bitumen, a sticky natural asphalt bubbling up from Mesopotamian soil, was another temple resource with almost magical properties. It waterproofed bricks, sealed canals, and coated boats. In rituals, it was also symbolic. Its dark sheen evoked both fertility and divine mystery. Archaeologists have found temple walls reinforced with bitumen layers that have survived thousands of years, testifying to its importance in both sacred and practical architecture. Festivals tied city life to the rhythms of the gods. The New Year festival, for instance, included the sacred marriage ritual in which the king united symbolically with Inanna through a high priestess. This was not private ceremony, but public drama, reinforcing the idea that human prosperity flowed directly from divine favor. When the ritual succeeded, the fields would flourish, the canals would flow, and the city would thrive. What makes Sumerian religion so compelling is how human it feels. Their gods were not flawless, they quarreled, loved, and grew jealous. Inanna descended into the underworld and was trapped there, only to return. Enki tricked, and schemed, bringing wisdom to humanity. These myths captured the unpredictability of human life, joy, tragedy, love, betrayal. They offered explanations, yes, but also reflections of human psychology, woven into divine form. To live in Sumer was to feel watched, guided, and judged by these divine personalities. The temples and ziggurats were more than symbols of devotion. They were the city's very identity. To walk into Uruk's Eanna precinct, dedicated to Inanna, was to step into a world of ritual feasts, music, and economic exchange. To ascend the ziggurat of Ur was to participate in a civic act as much as a spiritual one. Religion did not stand apart from society, it was society. Every loaf of bread, every canal dug, every law proclaimed was understood as part of the god's design. And yet beneath this sacred order, the ziggurat also whispered something else: ambition. Each new level built, each brick laid, was a declaration that human hands could raise mountains where none existed, that mortal effort could call the gods down from heaven. In those steps of clay, we glimpse humanity's oldest dream, not just to live under the gaze of the divine, but to bring the divine closer, to build a bridge between earth and sky. War, honor, and the cost of water. Early dynastic conflicts. Picture the Mesopotamian plain at dawn. The fields shimmer with dew, canals snake across the land, and farmers lead oxen toward the plow. Then the horns sound, the city gates open, and rows of men march out. Farmers turned soldiers for the season, spears and shields in hand, helmets of copper glinting in the rising sun. This is not just a raid for cattle or grain. This is war over water, the lifeblood of Sumer. In the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, the map of Sumer was a patchwork of rival city-states. Each one, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Ur, Nippur, saw itself not just as a community, but as a small universe with its own god, its own ruler, and its own destiny. Yet they all depended on the same fragile arteries, irrigation canals stretching across flat, thirsty land. A single blocked canal could doom a city's harvest. A diverted waterway could starve entire families. In such a world, borders were more than lines, they were survival itself. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma became the archetype of these conflicts. Both cities lay along fertile stretches of land divided by canals. Disputes simmered for years, then exploded into open war. On the stele of the vultures, carved around 2450 BCE, we see Eannatum, ruler of Lagash, leading his army in tight formation. Soldiers march in a disciplined shield wall, spears thrust outward, trampling fallen foes. Above, vultures swoop, carrying severed heads in their claws. It is one of the earliest war monuments in history, as much propaganda as record. Its message is clear: the gods of Lagash had granted victory, and the land was theirs. But the stele also tells us something subtler. Alongside the bloody imagery, it contains a legal inscription, a treaty asserting irrigation rights. Even in the heat of violence, Sumerians saw war not only as a clash of arms, but as a dispute over law, water, and justice. These battles were framed as verdicts delivered by the gods. If your city lost, it was not just poor strategy, it was a sign that your deity had abandoned you. Armies of this time were not professional in the way we imagine later. Most soldiers were seasonal farmers called up for campaigns. They carried spears, axes, and round or rectangular shields, often made of leather stretched over wood. Helmets of copper offered limited protection. Chariots existed, but they were heavy four-wheeled carts pulled by onagers, wild asses, better suited for shock and display than for swift maneuver. Yet for their time, these armies were sophisticated. The formations carved on steles show organized ranks anticipating the phalanxes of Greece nearly 2 millennia later. War was not constant, but it was cyclical, like the flooding rivers. Plant in spring, harvest in autumn, fight in between. Rulers used victories to claim legitimacy, boasting of divine favor. Inscriptions often begin with phrases like, "By the command of Enlil," or "Inanna granted me victory." For the people, this fused religion with politics. Battles were sacred contests, proving which city and which god deserved supremacy. Nippur, home of Enlil, played a strange role in all this. Though rarely a combatant, it acted as arbiter. Kings came there to seek divine sanction, to proclaim peace, or to justify conquest. The city's neutrality gave it prestige. It was the stage where gods, not men, were seen to decide the fate of Sumer. Conflict also bred innovation. Cities built higher walls, stronger gates, and more elaborate defenses. Weapons improved. Bronze-tipped spears replaced simple copper. Chariots were refined, and armor became sturdier. Administration adapted as well. To supply armies, rulers levied grain, beer, and livestock, recorded meticulously by scribes. War forced cities to become more organized, more centralized, though it also drained resources and lives. The human cost was enormous. Each campaign meant farmers away from fields, canals left untended, and families uncertain of survival. Defeat could mean enslavement, the loss of land, or the humiliation of tribute. The cycle of conflict left scars, both physical and cultural. Yet out of this violence, law codes, treaties, and records of boundaries emerged. The beginnings of international law, in a sense, born from endless disputes over soil and water. Honor was another fuel for war. Kings sought glory not just in defense, but in expansion. To rule Kish, for instance, was to claim the title King of Kish, a symbol of preeminence among Sumer's cities. This title carried immense weight, echoing across inscriptions as a badge of supremacy. Kingship itself was thought to be handed down from the heavens, but which city held it was always in contention. War was the mechanism by which cities tested who was worthy to carry divine kingship. At the same time, these wars produced culture. Victory steles, hymns celebrating triumphs, and lamentations over defeats all became part of the Sumerian literary record. In one hymn, a ruler prays for Enlil to smash the heads of my enemies like clay pots. In another, survivors mourn the destruction of fields, likening them to a mother stripped of her children. Through such texts, war entered memory not just as violence, but as narrative, stories that reinforced identity, loyalty, and faith. There is a haunting irony here. The same rivers that sustained life also fueled conflict. The same canals that watered fields became reasons for bloodshed. Sumer's brilliance, its cities, writing, religion, and laws, was built on fragile water management. And it was precisely this fragility that made unity so difficult. Instead of one great nation, Sumer remained a patchwork of rivals, each too proud to yield, each too dependent on its god to compromise. Their wars were both their strength, sharpening their organization, and their weakness, preventing lasting unity. As we watch these farmers-turned soldiers march across the plain, we hear echoes that stretch across history. The disputes of Lagash and Umma over irrigation canals are not so different from modern battles over rivers, oil fields, or borders. They remind us that the roots of conflict, resources, honor, survival have not changed in 5,000 years. And yet even in this age of constant rivalry, Sumer laid down something lasting. The treaties, the steles, the laws, all were attempts to give order to chaos, to transform violence into rules, to bind human passion within the framework of memory. War was not just destruction, it was also the forge where the first outlines of diplomacy, law, and history were hammered into being. So when we see the stele of the vultures today, with its grim scene of carrion birds circling above corpses, we are not just looking at the world's first war monument. We are looking at humanity's earliest struggle to understand violence, to give it meaning, to contain it, and to leave a record that said, we were here, we fought, and we believed the gods were with us. Sargon and the idea of empire, Akkad, circa 2334 to 2154 BCE. They say the child was placed in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch and set adrift upon the river. The waters carried him away until he was found and raised by a gardener. From those humble beginnings, he would rise to shatter the world he was born into and create something new. His name was Sargon, later called the Great. His story sounds like myth, yet it is carved into clay. The rise of the first man to turn Sumer's patchwork of city-states into a single empire. By the mid-24th century BCE, Sumer was locked in endless rivalry. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish each fought for dominance, but none could hold it for long. Kings claimed divine sanction, but their rule rarely extended beyond the horizon of their walls. Into this fractured world came Sargon, a man not born to kingship, but to obscurity. Some accounts say he was the cupbearer of the king of Kish, a trusted servant at court. Others insist he was a commoner, rising by ambition and cunning. Whatever the truth, he seized power in Kish, then marched outward city by city until all of Sumer bowed to him. His strategy was as daring as it was ruthless. Unlike seasonal armies of farmers, Sargon maintained a standing army, professional soldiers loyal to him, not to the fields they left behind. With this force, he crushed rivals swiftly and held territory firmly. Uruk fell, then then Lagash and Umma. In inscriptions, he boasts of washing his weapons in the sea, meaning he had conquered the land from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. For the first time in history, a ruler held dominion over not just one city-state, but an empire. But conquest alone does not make an empire, it makes ashes. Sargon's genius was administration. He established Akkad, a new capital whose precise location remains lost, but whose power reshaped Mesopotamia. From there, he appointed governors, often family members or loyal officials, to rule each city. He demanded tribute, yes, but he also built roads, depots, and communication networks. Grain flowed in, silver and timber flowed out. Cuneiform, once the tool of local scribes, became a bilingual instrument. Sumerian for religion and tradition, Akkadian for administration and empire. The empire was not just military, it was cultural fusion. Sargon also understood symbolism. He claimed the title King of Kish, but expanded it into King of the Four Quarters of the world. His image was crafted not only as ruler but as chosen by the gods. His daughter, Enheduanna, was installed as high priestess of Nana at Ur. More than a political appointment, it was a spiritual conquest, placing Akkadian blood at the heart of Sumer's most sacred cult. Enheduanna's hymns to Inanna became standard liturgy, uniting worship across the land. Through poetry, she did what armies could not, weave Sumerian and Akkadian into one fabric. The empire reached its peak under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. His reign marked a bold experiment in kingship. He declared himself a god in his own right, the first Mesopotamian king to do so. On his victory stele, we see him wearing a horned crown, a symbol of divinity, trampling enemies as stars shine above him. This was audacious. Until then, kings had ruled in the name of gods. Naram-Sin claimed to stand among them. His empire stretched wide from the Zagros Mountains to the Levant, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Akkad was no longer just a city-state, it was the center of a world. But even the mightiest empire can falter. Around 2200 BCE, the skies betrayed Akkad. Archaeological evidence points to the 4.2 kiloyear event, a century-long drought that dried rivers, withered crops and toppled trade networks. Tablets record famine, rebellion and collapse. The Gutians, tribes from the Zagros highlands, poured into the weakened land, raiding and disrupting what remained of Sargon's order. In lamentations carved later, scribes describe chaos. No grain was sown, no harvest reaped. The people wandered, their tongues split with thirst. The empire of Akkad, built with ambition and brilliance, dissolved in little more than a century. And yet, the idea it introduced never vanished. Before Sargon, power in Mesopotamia had been local. After Sargon, the dream of empire could never be forgotten. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, all would claim his mantle. His innovations, standing armies, appointed governors, road systems, centralized tribute, became templates for centuries to come. Even his legend outlived his empire. The tale of the child in the basket, raised to rule, echoed centuries later in the stories of Moses and Cyrus, perhaps carried forward by memory of the man who first united Sumer. What makes Sargon's story so compelling is the blend of myth and history. He was real, yet he shaped himself into legend. He conquered by force, but he bound by symbols. He rose from obscurity, yet claimed eternity. In a land of rival cities, he dared to imagine something larger, that humans could be tied not just by canals or gods of single cities, but by a shared political vision. For better or worse, that vision was empire. When we look back at Sargon today, we see both triumph and fragility. His empire burned brightly, then dimmed. His name endured, yet his capital was lost. But his idea that power could stretch across horizons, that people could be organized into something greater than city and kin, remains one of humanity's boldest inventions. In that sense, Sargon of Akkad was not just a conqueror. He was the first to teach us the dream and the danger of empire, collapse, lament, and renewal. Ur III, circa 2112 to 2004 BCE. The tablets say, "The city weeps, its people lie in ashes, its gods have abandoned their shrines." These words are not from a poet centuries later, but from the voices of the Sumerians themselves, lamentations etched into clay after their cities had burned. Yet before the sorrow came renewal, and before collapse came brilliance. This was the time of Ur III, the last great flowering of Sumer, before it faded into memory. After the fall of Akkad to famine and Gutian raids, Mesopotamia was fractured once again. The Gutians, rough highland tribes, ruled for nearly a century, remembered in Sumerian texts as dragons with human faces who knew not how to revere the gods. For generations, fields went untended, canals clogged, temples neglected. Then, out of this bleakness, a man named Ur-Nammu rose in the city of Ur. Around 2112 BCE, he overthrew the Gutians, stabilized the land, and proclaimed a new dynasty. His rule marked not just political revival, but cultural rebirth. Ur-Nammu left behind one of the most remarkable legacies of early law. His law code, predating Hammurabi's by centuries, survives in fragments. It sets fines for theft, punishments for assault, protections for widows and orphans. Unlike later eye for an eye justice, Ur-Nammu's code leaned toward compensation, measured penalties, rather than endless cycles of vengeance. In this sense, it reflects a society seeking order after chaos, fairness after years of turmoil. His successor, Shulgi, transformed this revival into a true renaissance. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, and in that time, he reshaped the land. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring fair trade across cities. He built and repaired roads, setting up way stations stocked with supplies so travelers could cross safely. He professionalized the bureaucracy, filling archives with meticulous records of grain, livestock, labor, and tribute. The empire ran on the baila system, a rotating tribute in which each province contributed goods on schedule to feed the center. It was a machine of astonishing precision. Every sack of barley, every sheep, every jar of oil tracked and redistributed. But Shulgi was not just an administrator. He was also a patron of culture. He rebuilt the great ziggurat of dedicating it to Nana, the moon god, and filled his cities with temples and monuments. Hymns in his honor describe him as a scholar, a musician, even a runner who claimed to have raced from Nippur to in a single day. Whether exaggeration or propaganda, the image is clear. Shulgi was a king who saw himself not only as ruler, but as embodiment of civilization itself. In these years, art and literature flourished. Hymns, epics, and laments were composed and copied in temple schools. Scribes filled shelves with texts that would outlast their world. Some of the oldest surviving love songs, ritual hymns, and myths date to this period. In their words, we hear voices not just of rulers, but of priests, poets, and common worshippers. It is as if the Sumerians, sensing the fragility of their world, were determined to leave their memory in clay. Yet beneath the brilliance lay cracks. The Bala tribute system, efficient at first, grew burdensome. Provinces groaned under the weight of quotas. Droughts strained agriculture. Enemies pressed at the borders, Elamites from the east, Amorite tribes from the west. The centralized bureaucracy that had once kept order now became rigid, brittle, unable to adapt. And when stress mounted, the system collapsed. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites swept into Sumer. They sacked dragging its king into captivity. Temples were burned, ziggurats toppled, canals destroyed. In the chaos, people turned to lamentation. The lament for survives in haunting lines. The storm swept over the land, the people groaned, the walls fell into ruin. The gods abandoned their shrines. The city was turned to dust.
These were not later historians, but eyewitnesses trying to make sense of devastation by framing it as divine judgment. What makes these laments so powerful is their humanity. They do not glorify war or celebrate victory. They mourn, raw, aching, intimate. They describe mothers losing children, fields lying barren, temples echoing empty. They ask, why did the gods forsake us? Why did Nana abandon his beloved city of For the first time in history, we hear a people questioning their gods, wrestling with despair, yet still preserving their grief in words. It is a reminder that civilization is not only built with clay, it is also buried with it. And yet, even in collapse, something endured. Sumerian culture did not vanish with Ur-3. Its language, myths, and literature were absorbed by the Amorites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Its law codes informed Hammurabi.
Its hymns and stories, copied for centuries, carried the memory of Sumer long after its cities had crumbled. The empire ended, but its voice continued. Ur-3 stands then as both triumph and tragedy. In a few generations, it showed the heights Sumer could reach: law, art, administration, architecture. Then revealed how fragile those heights were against drought, enemies, and time. Its fall gave birth to one of the world's oldest traditions of lament, a chorus of sorrow carved into clay. In their tears, the Sumerians left us not only their glory, but their grief. And so, as the ziggurats of turned to ruins and its streets fell silent, what survived was the memory, the haunting, unforgettable echo of a people who, even as their world collapsed, refused to let their story die. Afterglow and disappearance, Isin Lhasa and memory drift, circa 2000 to 1763 BCE. When the city of fell, many believed the gods had turned their faces away forever. Yet history rarely ends in a single moment. After the fires cooled and the lamentations faded, something remarkable happened. Out of the ashes of collapse rose a quieter age, not of empire and glory, but of persistence. This was the time of Isin and Larsa, city-states that carried the fading torch of Sumer into the second millennium BCE. The Isin dynasty was founded by Ishbiera, a former governor who escaped the chaos of Ur's fall and established his own rule around 2017 BCE. For nearly a century, Isin claimed to be the rightful heir of Ur's legacy. Its rulers took on old Sumerian titles, restored temples, and maintained rituals. They rebuilt canals, collected tribute, and sought to preserve continuity. It was as if they were whispering to their people, "Sumer is not gone, we are still here." But, in truth, the ground was shifting. The Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who had once been outsiders on the western fringes, were now integrated into the heart of Mesopotamia. Their dynasties began to dominate politics, blending their language with Akkadian and gradually pushing Sumerian into the background. By 1900 BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken on the streets. It lived only in temples and scribal schools, preserved as a scholarly and liturgical language, much as Latin would be in medieval Europe centuries later. The city of Larsa soon challenged Isin's dominance. Under rulers like Rim-Sin I, Larsa expanded aggressively, taking over key trade routes and rival cities. Its prosperity came not from conquest alone, but from managing canals and land more effectively than its neighbors. For a time, Larsa became the most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia, overshadowing Isin and carrying forward Sumer's traditions. Yet neither Isin nor Larsa could unify the land. Their rivalry drained resources and weakened defenses, leaving the south vulnerable to the rise of a new power further north, Babylon. And here lies the paradox of Sumer's afterglow. Politically, the old cities were fading. Their dynasties were overshadowed by Amorite rulers. Their armies no longer dominated the plains. But culturally, Sumer was everywhere. Its hymns and myths were copied in Akkadian translations. Its gods, Inanna, Enlil, Enki, Nanna, remained central to Mesopotamian religion. Its laws, like those of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar of Isin, formed the foundation for Hammurabi's famous code. Even as the Sumerians lost their spoken language, their ideas lived on in the tablets of their successors. One of the most fascinating aspects of this era is the role of temple libraries. In places like Nippur, scribes carefully recopied Sumerian texts, hymns, incantations, legal codes, myths. They did so not because the language was still alive in conversation, but because they saw it as sacred knowledge. To be educated in Mesopotamia meant to study Sumerian, just as scholars of later ages would study Latin or Sanskrit. Through these libraries, the voice of Sumer survived centuries longer than its politics. Without them, epics like Gilgamesh might have vanished entirely. This slow drift from living culture to remembered culture gives the Isin-Larsa age a bittersweet quality. It was not a collapse like that of Ur-3, sudden and devastating. It was more like twilight, the soft fading of a language, the quiet persistence of rituals, the gradual handover of memory. Even Hammurabi, the Amorite king who conquered Larsa in 1763 BCE, stood upon Sumerian shoulders. His law code, one of the most famous in history, was rooted in precedents set by Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar. His gods were Sumerian gods. His scribes copied Sumerian texts. Babylon was new, but it was also continuation. What does it mean for a civilization to disappear in this way? The Sumerians were not wiped out by invaders or erased by disaster. Their people blended into the Amorites and Babylonians. Their cities were repopulated. Their culture was absorbed. And yet, their distinct identity, their language, their claim to kingship, slipped quietly into memory. They did not vanish like a flame doused, but like a flame passed from one torch to another. The light continued even if the hand that first struck the spark was forgotten. Archaeologists today marvel at this transition. In Isin and Lhasa, they find evidence of continuity, temple rebuilding, hymnody, legal texts, and evidence of change, new rulers, new dialects, new political structures. It is a reminder that civilizations rarely die all at once. They linger, adapt, and reshape themselves in the memories of those who follow. So in the centuries after Ur's destruction, Sumer's story was not silence. It was memory drifting into the hands of others. It was hymns sung in a language no one spoke anymore, laws recopied by scribes who knew they were ancient, myths retold in Akkadian but still echoing with Sumerian gods. It was twilight, not night. And in that twilight, Sumer laid the foundation for Babylon's dawn. Rediscovery, from mounds to music, 19th to 20th century. CE. For nearly 4,000 years, the voice of Sumer lay buried under the sands of Mesopotamia. The mud brick walls crumbled into dust, ziggurats melted into shapeless mounds, and the once great cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur became little more than nameless hills on the horizon. Travelers passed them by without knowing that beneath their feet lay the first writing, the first laws, the first hymns ever created. Sumer, the civilization that had once invented memory itself, was forgotten until the world began to listen again. In the mid-19th century, whispers rose from the ruins. Adventurers and scholars, spades in hand, began to peel back the earth. In 1849, Austin Henry Layard excavated at Nineveh and uncovered vast palaces of Assyrian kings. Among the finds were thousands of clay tablets, their surfaces marked with strange, wedge-shaped impressions. To most, they were incomprehensible scratches, but a few scholars suspected they were the lost words of the ancient Near East. The key came from far away, the Behistun inscription in Persia, carved high into a cliff by Darius the Great. Like the Rosetta Stone, it carried the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. In the 1850s, Henry Rawlinson painstakingly copied and deciphered it, unlocking Akkadian cuneiform. From there, scholars worked backward, slowly recognizing that beneath Akkadian was an even older language, a language no longer spoken anywhere. They called it Sumerian. With this breakthrough, the forgotten world of Sumer began to rise again. Excavations at Ur, led by Sir Leonard Woolley, in the 1920s, revealed tombs untouched for millennia. The most stunning was that of Queen Puabi, buried around 2500 BCE, her body adorned with gold headdresses, lapis lazuli beads, and carnelian jewelry imported from distant lands. Around her lay attendants who had followed her in death, lyres decorated with golden bull heads, instruments that had once played at feasts in Sumer's courts. When archaeologists carefully lifted one of those lyres, its strings long rotted away, they realized they were holding not just an artifact, but an echo of music, the very soundscape of the world's first civilization. Nearby, another discovery captured imaginations: the Standard of Ur. A small box inlaid with shell, lapis, and red limestone, it depicted scenes of war and peace. On one side, soldiers marching in ranks and prisoners brought before a king. On the other, banquets with lyres and cups of beer raised high. It was a Sumerian story in miniature, a reminder that even in their art, they balanced violence and celebration, sorrow and joy. But perhaps the most human finds were not treasures, but tablets, thousands upon thousands of them. Administrative records listing barley rations, contracts for marriage, adoption agreements, tax rolls, hymns, prayers, and myths. Among them, school exercises from Eduba scribal classrooms. Some tablets showed neat, careful signs, others clumsy scrawls. And in a few, little doodles appeared, sketches of animals, jokes, even insults scratched by weary students. Suddenly Sumer was not just kings and gods, it was children grumbling at homework 5,000 years ago, their voices carried forward in clay. Through these finds, the forgotten became familiar again. The Sumerians re-emerged not as abstract firsts in history books, but as people who sang songs, quarreled over irrigation, played board games, and prayed to their gods for mercy. Their laments over destroyed cities preserved for millennia now read like living voices. The people groan, the walls lie in dust, the gods have left us. And yet here we are, centuries later, still listening to them. The rediscovery of Sumer did more than fill history books. It reshaped our understanding of civilization. Suddenly it was not Egypt alone that could claim the title of earliest high culture, but a land between two rivers. It was Sumer that first gave us writing, law, monumental cities, and a record of human imagination. It was Sumer that turned memory into history. And perhaps that is the true miracle. The Sumerians themselves were forgotten. Their name vanished for millennia. Their language stopped being spoken. Their gods were replaced. Their cities crumbled. And yet, because they had invented writing, they could never vanish entirely. When their tablets were uncovered, they began to speak again, across time, across silence, across 4,000 years of forgetting. If you close your eyes, you might hear them still. The scratch of a reed stylus on clay, the chant of priests beneath a ziggurat at dawn, the laughter of children throwing dice in the royal game of the mournful song of a lyre in a queen's tomb. These sounds are gone, yet not gone. They linger, faint but insistent, in every word we write today, in every law we pass, in every clock we check, for behind them all lies the memory of the first people who thought to leave a permanent mark. And so Sumer ends where it began, not in silence, but in words, rediscovered, retranslated, reimagined. The people who invented history became a part of it once more, their story written not just in clay, but in the hearts of all who listen.